The Lord be with you.
And with your spirit.
A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Luke.
Glory to you, O Lord.
On a Sabbath, Jesus went to dine at the home of one of the leading Pharisees, and the people there were observing him carefully. He told a parable to those who had been invited, noticing how they were choosing the places of honor at the table. When you are invited by someone to a wedding banquet, do not recline at table in the place of honor. A more distinguished guest than you may have been invited by him, and the host, who invited you both, may approach you and say, "Give your place to this man," and then you would proceed with embarrassment to take the lowest place. Rather, when you are invited, go and take the lowest place, so that when the host comes to you, he may say, "My friend, move up to a higher position." Then you will enjoy the esteem of your companions at table. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. Then he said to his host, who invited him, "When you hold a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or your wealthy neighbors, in case they may invite you back and you have your repayment. Rather, when you hold a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. Blessed indeed will you be because of their inability to repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, Lord Jesus Christ.
Thank you, Kevin. This past week, I was visiting my mother in California, and we went out to dinner with my brother, and as often happens when my brother and I are together, our conversation turned to what it was like to grow up on a small dairy many years ago. My dad, he had this expression about dinner manners. When the six of us kids were gathered around the table, his instruction was that we always had to keep one foot on the floor when we were reaching for the food. Everything else, fair game. Which is kind of funny because actually my dad had pretty strict table manners and table rules. You see, my grandmother, who often ate with us because she lived next door, she was always served first. Then the food was passed to the youngest. He would also jokingly correct us if we took too much food on the first pass. "Looks like we need a little bigger plate for you there, Ed." I know he wanted to teach us how to behave. He wanted us to learn humility at the dinner table. It's a great place for an example. Isn't that why Jesus used it in the parable? But looking back, it seems different to me now. My dad's dinner often came at the end of a very long day of driving truck. He also was farming with my uncle at the end of the day. Sometimes I think he simply wanted just to be humble, to have some peace from the kingdom of God. The humility at the dinner table was not only a lesson, but it was, in fact, an end in and of itself. The reading from Sirach today is a teaching of wisdom. It tells us how to behave if we are to be good. Humility, as in my example with my father, humility in Sirach is an end in and of itself. It is a beautiful and necessary part of simply being a child of God. These words really are beautiful to hear, but we need examples, right? Humility, what does that mean? How do we do that? And this is what Jesus is doing in the gospel. He's taking this traditional teaching of Sirach and giving us something to bite into, something to chew on. When you sit down at table, how do you do it? Right? We all know about table manners. Even children have a sense of it. So the story of the guest at the wedding, this guest, as in the example of the parable, he sits in the place of honor, which is both understandable, we know it, and it's funny. Who goes to a wedding and sits at the place reserved for the bride and the groom? It's why the parable makes sense. When you're not humble, you will be humbled. In the gospel, though, Jesus slightly turns the Sirach passage. You see, Jesus tells it, even if you don't care a fig about the kingdom of God, be humble anyway. When you are humble, you'll be praised by others, and you will advance socially. Now, I don't think this is necessarily what Jesus is trying to teach us about humility, but it's simply a way of adding emphasis. You see, even the hypocrites practice humility. They may do it for the wrong reasons, but even they who don't know the kingdom practice humility. How much more should we Christians practice humility? Humility can be an instrument to achieve something else, but if we're acting humble to achieve something greater, we're sort of missing the point. In small acts of humility, we enter a small part of the kingdom of God. Humility, it's something we do all the time in our daily lives. If you think about it for a second, if you think about it, you can name those moments when you're humble. Do you step aside to allow someone who is in a hurry to pass you? Do you hold the door for another who may have their hands full? In those cases, you're humbling your to-do list before someone else's to-do list. Sometimes, and this is part of the reason I was out visiting my mom, she's had some illnesses, and sometimes honestly accepting a medical diagnosis, it requires powerful humility. You know, one of the things I struggle with is listening. Do I fully and humbly listen to what someone else has to say before I speak? In my daily life as a manager at work and as a parent, I struggle with this. Why would I listen to someone else? I know the right answer. I am dad and I am boss, right? My wife's laughing at me. She thinks this is pretty funny. No, actually, I don't really know the right answer, right? I don't know it at least fully. There is one all-knowing God, and I am not He. In humbly listening to another, I may find a piece of that truth that I have overlooked. In seeking to understand first, I am humbling myself before another. We all act humbly. My friends, this week, let me encourage you to take some time with this gospel. Write down the things that you do that are humble. My guess is you can come up with a pretty good list if you take a few minutes at it. Look at these moments, because these are the moments that are the kingdom of God. And then, with this list, ask yourself, how do I have more of these humble moments? The story in the gospel takes place when Jesus is on the road to Jerusalem. Jesus is going to the cross. The larger message in the gospel also is clear. We must learn from these small acts of humility if we are to understand the ultimate act of humility that is the cross. So, how do I extend humility from small things into larger things in my life? You know, some days I feel like I'm surrounded by acts of inhumility. Trash talk sports, vulgar political speech. We need a little more humility in our society. We need more kingdom of God in our public life. So this week, when you're rereading this gospel, ask yourself, how can I be humble in my larger life as well? At one point when I was writing this homily, Mary, my wife, she laughed at me because I was getting carried away with the topic of humility. And so, to paraphrase her comment, she said, sooner or later you need to do something humbly. So true. And when we are humble, we see more clearly the world as it is and not as our pride would have it. And with that clear vision, then we can see what God would have us do. Jesus humbled himself on the cross. This gives us hope and confidence in our own humble actions, because no matter what, I trust that God has got this. Christ promised to be with us always until the end of the age. And so I act humbly in his way, trusting in his cross and resurrection. Come to the table of the Lord and see the wisdom that he offers us there. Taste and see his humble promise, the goodness of the Lord.